Hi folks, welcome to the second mini lecture in week 3 in Geography 4880. So we left off here last time. We were discussing, well, we introduced the notion of reading the landscape. We put that on pause, we parked that. We then reviewed some of the early components of the development of geohumanities and critical human geography in particular in the 1970s. So we explored the emergence of Marxist geographies, okay, a structuralist approach to building knowledge about the world that is interested not just in the observable empirical facts that we can get our hands on, but in looking at underlying structures and relations that may not be directly observable, but then nonetheless guide human action. And we looked at how some of the key developments in Marxist geographies included the notion that space is something that's produced and nature is something that is produced. And those are tricky concepts. They're really important. We'll explore them in further detail in a little bit through exploring the work of key thinkers like Neil Smith. We'll get to that in just a little bit in a different mini lecture, but that's where we ended up. And we're going to see now that at the same time that all this was unfolding, at the same time that Marxist geographies was developing as a reaction to positivist, empirical focused, theory neutral, spatial science and urban and economic geography, at the same time that that was happening, we see a rise of humanistic thinking in geography, okay? So unlike the Marxist geographers who really turned everything back to capitalism and the relations of production between workers and capitalists, okay, humanistic geographers and humanists in general will say humans are willful agents and not simply puppets of mysterious forces, that are, behind structures like capitalism. Instead, life is complicated. Humans are complicated. It's not so easy to just pin on everything on capitalism. And so the humanities is generally skeptical of singular measurable truths out there that can be assessed objectively. Okay, so really skeptical of the positivist notion that there is a world out there that we can access and measure objectively without consideration for who we are and the biases that we might bring to understanding the world. Okay, and the humanities is not something that's particularly familiar to you, even though you should already by now have some sort of humanities or College of the Arts credits under your belt before you graduate. We're talking about disciplines here such as literary studies, languages, history, art, philosophy, media, and cultural studies. Okay, so how does this all play out with geography? What does geography have to do with it? Well, it has inspired the creation of subfields such as humanistic geographies, or as I've labeled it here, geohumanities, same thing. And those inspired by this tradition of geographic thought ask questions like, how do people move through and experience space differently? So, whereas Marxist geographers might ask a question about how capitalism and the relations of production between workers and capitalists produce spaces, okay, give rise to poor areas, rich areas, so on and so forth. Humanists and geohumanists would ask questions like, well, how do people actually experience those spaces? How do they move through them? And also, how do text, painting, images, stories, video influence, all that kind of media, how do those influence our perceptions and experiences of space? Okay. So in short, humanistic geography, as it began to unfurl and develop in the 1970s, is a reaction both to spatial science in the form of urban and economic geography of the 60s and 70s, okay, as a reaction to the kinds of assumptions those geographers were making about how economic imperatives were really, in cost minimization, were really driving what people did, and they were reacting to the kinds of assumptions that positivist geographers were making at the time of, well, we can model anything, we just have to abstract from real conditions greatly. Okay, humanistic geographers were reacting to that and saying, well, actually, we have to consider there's real people behind these models who have lived experiences that we need to consider. They were reacting to that and to the structuralist approaches that were emerging at the time in the form of like Marxist geographies, which also didn't really consider lived experiences, okay? Instead, everything could be sort of reduced to, well, we have capitalism. That means workers don't own the means of production, capitalists own the means of production. And this is why we get, poor parts of cities and rich parts of cities, okay? Humanists instead said, well, what about the experiences of real human beings in those different parts of the cities? Now, humanistic geography was inspired by, in part, and also gave rise to, it co-emerged with something known as post-structuralism. So we've just seen how humanistic geography was very skeptical of structuralist approaches like those of Marxist geography, in part because structuralism posits underlying forces that mysteriously guide human behavior, and it really is skeptical about our agency in relation to those structures. Okay. Humanistic geographies gave rise to, also was shaped by, co-emerged with post-structuralism, which holds that beings, and this includes humans, but also other elements of our world, be they living or even non-living, that beings have individual agency against, in relation to structures, to see and act beyond them, beyond things like capitalism, that we are not something that can be reduced to the economic conditions that are inherent to capitalism. Post-structuralism also holds that, again, there is no direct access to a singular reality, okay, that we can somehow see through and access without consideration of our own biases and positions and so on. Instead, people live and work in different spaces, experience structures differently. So they're not necessarily throwing out the notion that there are structures, okay, but that our experience of them is really important to pay attention to. And that experience is going to differ on categories such as gender. There were, men, women, whatever, race, and class. Likewise, post-structuralism holds that how we experience spaces is very much influenced by media and discourses, okay? And in fact, according to post-structuralists, those things might be more important to pay attention to than something like capitalism and thinking about the means of production and relations of production, okay? These discourses that we encounter on an everyday basis in the news and on Twitter and on social media in general and whatever, they may actually govern our collective behavior more so than the fact of whether or not we own the means of production, okay? And just from a paper published literally yesterday, something that explains just how important discourses are to advancing power. So critical human geographers have situated ads as one of the discursive texts by which institutions of power, be they governments or corporations, visualize nature in order to advance their interests. Okay, so we'll explore that in just a second in a bit more detail, but let's follow up first with this notion of how we experience space differently. Okay, here's an example that might be helpful for us to think through. This is a flight, a plane. And we could think about this in terms of how a structuralist might and look at how mobility is structured by things such as class and economic inequality, and the fact that the rich people are obviously going to be flying more. And we could talk about the emergence of flight as a result of our capitalist economies, so on and so forth. Those are all valid questions that a Marxist geographer might make. But the humanist geographers influenced by post-structuralism might say, well, what does it actually mean to be on a plane? Okay. And what is that embodied experience? Okay. You are not just a vat of, your brain is not simply just in a vat, right? You have a body, okay? And your body feels certain things and moves in certain ways and experiences space in different ways. We have physical sensations. We might get queasy. We might, have a panic attack. We might get anxious, flying on a plane. Okay, and those are all important considerations to think of in terms of this is life, and this is a geographical question because it's about how moving through space inspires different kinds of emotions. To the second question about how media discourses shape our understanding of spaces, let's take this as an example. These are all images that I just Googled the other day of a particular place in Costa Rica that I've been to and researched. And these images structure how we, as tourists, potential tourists, or just curious people, understand this place in Costa Rica, okay? These images structure, well, they at least greatly shape, I won't say structure because, we have agency to think beyond that structure, according to the post-structuralists, but they definitely shape and perhaps discipline how we understand places like Costa Rica. So great example of this, we have here images of, the coast and palm trees and sandy beaches. And if there are people in these images, they're kind of off in the distance, okay? And these are images of landscapes that are meant to invite a certain understanding of the place as depopulated, somewhere you can get away from people, as perhaps underdeveloped, as natural, okay? Many of those things may not actually be true, okay? There's actually, quite a village and town right off the beach here that's not in the image. The photography has been done in such a way as to blind our look at what else is going on nearby, okay? And that is something that post-structuralists have come to deem as the gaze, okay? G-A-Z-E, in which the ways in which we are exposed to the world through images, and this also applies to text, is definitely directed by the lens of these images that point our view in some directions, namely to things like beaches and palm trees and whatever, and not others, to the villages nearby that show us, relatively poor people, that are things that are not going to inspire us to go and travel there, okay? So, that's an example of a humanistic approach shaped by post-structuralist thinking that illustrates the importance of discourse and setting the terms of how we understand a space and a place, okay? And in this example, we come to understand it as, natural, depopulated, whatever, and not as, a small village with, people who are struggling and so on and so forth. So just to wrap up for this mini lecture and the previous one, we actually see, especially in more recent decades, the past 2 or 3 decades, that these two things, post-structuralism and structuralism, can find common ground. And in particular, Marxist geographies and post-structuralism can find some common ground, okay? And indeed, much Marxist geography today is informed by post-structuralist thought in order to recognize the agency of individuals, that although workers may not own the means of production by definition, that they certainly have agency in ways to eke out a living for themselves and make change within the workplace and so on. that we can actually document and describe their experiences of working conditions and so on. That we can recognize differences, that we are not all just workers, but that we are workers differentiated by gender, race, so on and so forth. And in general, that we can recognize the limits of structural explanations. And indeed, one of the key lines of thought here has been from feminist geographers who have said, okay, there's something to Marxist geographies, but we also have to understand that we can't just hold up capitalism to be more coherent and dominant than it really is. So the feminist geographers, Gibbs and Graham, have really advanced our notion there. The notion that that we have a discourse about what capitalism is and how it works, and that sometimes that discourse can be a little bit too overwhelming and overpowering, and that instead we need to look for some of the fractures and flaws in these big structures. And indeed, as you read about in chapter 7, we sometimes, or Marxist geographers sometimes, misunderstand how determinative the relations of production are, okay? So it's not just that we have capitalism as an economic system, it gives rise to certain cultures and ideology, but indeed, there is a much more open process or connection between those two things, where struggle and agency and action can actually change cultures, and that can even lead to economic change, okay? And so, this is a very broad review of some of these big trends and currents in geographic thought, okay? And in the next mini lecture, we'll start by looking at how these lines of thinking have been embodied by key thinkers.